Welcome to our discussion of the Age of Enlightenment. I hope you'll find this to be a very interesting discussion because it lays down some of the foundations for the American government, the French Revolution, and much of modern thinking. Let's talk about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a way of thinking, and we need to compare it to what might have happened in the past. So with the Renaissance, we get a way of thinking that we have already discussed in some detail. It's called humanism. Humanism believed that humans' greatest tool is intelligence. Then from that intelligence, we saw how the scientific awakening arose. Well, the scientific awakening can be applied outside of science, outside of natural science. It can be applied to the social sciences and to other areas like philosophy and religion. And when that is done, we get a concept called the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is really the application of scientific principles outside of the area of natural science. The Enlightenment then re-enshrines intelligence as its principal focus and method for understanding. So we now get humanism to intelligence, to scientific awakening and the Enlightenment, and then back again to intelligence. So the Enlightenment is the scientific method applied to society as well as to nature, and the period of time is roughly 1650 to perhaps as late as 1830. It began in England and then moved to France and then eventually moved to other parts of the Western world, including America. Some have called this the Age of Reason because reason and intelligence is so important. In fact, the Enlightenment actually glorified reason. There were some who tried to make reason a god, much as a Christian god, or perhaps even more realistically, like the ancient gods of Greece. And they said that reason was the god. The view of these people was progressive and rationalistic and humanistic, so there were a lot of positives associated with it. And they believed that this view was focused on the rising middle class. Therefore, things were optimistic, and they believed that humankind's abilities would lead eventually to progress and improvement through reason. There were inevitably some comparisons and discussions about the Enlightenment and religion. In the case of religion, it is generally believed that faith is higher than reason, but in the case of the Enlightenment, it's reversed. Reason supersedes faith. There is, in addition, a distrust of traditional organized religion. In particular, the Catholic Church came under great criticism during this period. There is also a belief within the Enlightenment that society can get better as science guides humankind. They believe that science is the guiding influence rather than religion, and therefore religion is given a secondary role to science. Some religions believe that original sin taints humankind, but that's not true in the Enlightenment. They believe that humans are naturally good, and therefore the concept of original sin is not believed. There is another concept associated with the Enlightenment that has to do with our earthly life. Enlightenment thinkers believe that the earthly life is the time for happiness, and they minimized and perhaps ridiculed the belief that happiness would come in the next life. They said, why wait? Why think about it? Let's live the good life now. Don't focus on heaven. We can see, therefore, in broadest terms, that the Enlightenment arose because of creativity applied to science, where science, in its very linear way, focused on the natural world, if we take a lateral view and move over into the other areas of human endeavor like politics and human relationships, that moving of one idea into a lateral field is certainly creative, and that's the essence of what happened when the Enlightenment was created. So let's talk about what science learned and then see how it was applied to the field of human endeavor and human relationships. Science, coming into the period of the Enlightenment, said the world and heavens are all made from the same materials, and the world and heavens all obey the same natural laws. Those arose from the scientific awakening that we have just discussed. In essence, it is a unified theory of the universe. If we apply those concepts laterally, we can apply them to government, that's called political science, to human interactions, and that's called, among others, sociology and economics, and to human thinking, that's called psychology. So those social sciences arose because of the application of the principles of science to areas of human interaction. When all of that was done, there were 2 9 issues that remained to be explored. One of them is, how does God fit in? And the second, how does the human soul, if it exists, fit in? Those 2 concepts still needed to be explored. One way of addressing those 2 issues was to adopt what became known as deism, or scientific religion. In deism, God is thought of as the great watchmaker, very much a deterministic world, where all of the laws of nature are fixed by God, and then nature is just given its free rein, and it runs like a clock with no additional input from God. God is therefore distant. Deists tended to believe in, reject churches. They were anti-clerical, and they were skeptical of any organized religion. Deists expected ethical, enlightened behavior of all people, and they trusted that people in their goodness, inherent goodness, would practice ethical principles. A good example of a deist is Thomas Paine, a man very important in the American Revolution, and we'll talk about him later in another lecture. But Thomas Paine gave us a nice working definition of deism. He said, "Here it is that the religion of deism is superior to the Christian religion. It, deism, is free from all those invented and torturing articles that shock our reason or injure our humanity, and with which the Christian religion abounds. Its creed is pure and sublimely simple. It believes in God, and there it rests." So we might ask ourselves, why would deism flourish in the Age of Enlightenment? Well, it flourished because it was rational, it was scientifically based, and in this period of the Enlightenment, the same values were held. But there was a danger in the view of many people, and that danger was what we might call the slippery slope to atheism. Here we see a picture of that. On the slippery slope, we see that people who are conservative adopt liberal views. That's a little bit questionable, but maybe acceptable. But those with liberal views, perhaps those who are most enchanted with the Enlightenment, become deists. They believe in God, but a distant God. And then those deists become agnostics, where they doubt or they just don't know whether God exists. And finally, they become atheists, where they don't believe that God exists at all. Therefore, there has been and continues to be a tension between deism and organized religion. And in essence, between Enlightenment thinking and organized religion? Well, let's talk about some of the key thinkers in the Enlightenment. And one of them is Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes lived at the same time as Galileo, and in fact, on a trip to Europe, he visited Galileo, and there he received some training in science. Thomas Hobbes was, therefore, a good physical scientist in the normal sense. He wanted to understand matter, the essence of the universe. And he had a comment, and he said, "All that is real is material, and what is not material is not real." So we can see very clearly that Thomas Hobbes was what we would call a materialist. He further said, "Any speech referring to immaterial substances is without meaning." So for Hobbes, all things were material. Even spirits had to be composed of some kind of material, something. There were others who supported the materialistic view, and by that I don't mean seeking money, but that all things are made out of matter. Puritan Richard Baxter said, "The soul is a substance, for that which is nothing can do nothing. It is not bones and flesh that understand, but a pure substance, as all acknowledge." Later, a Unitarian theologist and famous chemist, Joseph Priestley, said, "The original and still prevailing idea concerning a soul or spirit is that of a kind of attenuated aerial substance of a more subtle nature than gross bodies." These definitions are somewhat similar to the revealed Word of God to Joseph Smith in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 131. Let me refresh your memory of what that says. "There is no such thing as immaterial matter. All spirit is matter, but it is more fine or pure, and can only be discerned by pure eyes." Therefore, we see that there is a convergence of opinion between Joseph Smith and these previous thinkers who believed in a material universe. Now let's go back to Hobbes and take a look at how he applied his scientific knowledge to government. He decided that the way that science would work would be similar to what Descartes did. Go back to a place where you have a fundamental. And in Hobbes's view, that meant go back to earliest civilization or earliest mankind. And therefore, he thought back to early mankind, and he decided that mankind's basic nature could be determined. What do you think it was? Was early mankind basically warlike or basically peaceful? Well, in the view of Hobbes, as reported in his book Leviathan, he said, early man's life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and in a constant state of war, living in continual fear and danger of violent death. So, if you like to think of Hobbes and say cavemen were always at war, and they had a terrible life, and they were always fearful. So it was a tough life. Well, Hobbes believed that early mankind needed to do something to stabilize that life. And God was favorable to mankind and gave God a method for stabilizing his life. That method was a king. Monarchs were set up by God to help mankind control the conditions of life. Therefore, as you can imagine, Hobbes backed the idea of absolute monarchy. Might mention at this point that Hobbes lived at the time of James I, who was an absolute monarch, and therefore you can see that his views coincided with those of the king at exactly the same time. How did Hobbes' concepts affect religion? Well, because God was the principal actor to set up the kings, religion was revered and respected as a method of communication between God and man. There is an interesting modern concept that I'd like to just expose you to. It's called evolutionary psychology, and it talks about the necessity of early religion. The question is, why does mankind have religion? According to evolutionary psychology, human history is many thousands of years old. And for most of that time, perhaps as much as 99%, humans were hunter-gatherers. Our brains evolved to solve problems during our entire history, and those problems that we solved were solved as if we were hunter-gatherers. Civilization is quite recent in the history of mankind, but we still solved our problems according to those solutions worked out when we were the warlike hunter-gatherers. Therefore, the natural man may be a recognition of that tendency of earth creatures to solve problems by hunter-gatherer mechanisms developed during the time of warfare, rather than a more modern method that is part of civilization. So religion may be part of civilization to overcome that earlier hunter-gatherer mentality or orientation. It's an interesting concept that gives some credence to why religion is intimately related to the birth of civilization. Okay, that's Thomas Hobbes. Now let's take a few moments and speak about John Locke, who is about a half a generation after Thomas Hobbes. John Locke was a friend of Newton, a strong empiricist, good training in the physical sciences. He was a physician, and he was an anti-absolute monarchist. And during the period of James I, Charles I, and Charles II, he fled England and resided in Holland for his own safety and the safety of his mentor, who had similar beliefs. In Europe, they understood and compared the Republic of Holland with the parliamentary dictatorship of Cromwell, and Locke did not appreciate or enjoy the dictatorial concepts put forth by Oliver Cromwell. Therefore, Locke began to orchestrate a new kind of government. He saw Cromwell's successor in the restoration of the monarchy, but was still unhappy. He didn't like the tendencies of absolutism found in the Stuart family, who were ruling through Charles II and James II. Therefore, Locke helped orchestrate the concepts of the Glorious Revolution, where William and Mary left Holland and came over to England to assume the duties of king and queen. In fact, Locke was not only instrumental in that, but he returned with them and continued in England for the rest of his life under the reign of William and Mary. Locke wrote extensively on how mankind should be governed. He is sometimes called the forefather of our forefathers because much of his statements and teachings on government were adopted by Thomas Jefferson and others in the Declaration of Independence and then further in the Constitution. John Locke, again, copied the concept of Hobbes in trying to discover what type of government would be most appropriate. He returned to the early state of mankind. But in contrast to Hobbes, Locke believed that early mankind was peaceful. And even though life was peaceful, there were still dangers. There were threats to peace and freedom. And therefore, he believed that early humans got together and, on their own initiative, organized a pact where they would give up some rights in exchange for protection of a unit. And he saw this, the formation of government and civilization, because of this compact made between the parties. The cooperation required, obviously, that all of these people observe the rule of law. So Locke's foundation was the rule of law and a compact or contract between the human parties that they would give up some rights for the protection of the group. Let's read what Locke said with respect to this. Government can never have a right to destroy, enslave, or designedly to impoverish the subjects. To this end, it is that men give up all their natural power to the society they enter into, and the community puts the legislative power into such hands as they think fit, with this trust that they shall be governed by declared laws, or else their peace, quiet, and property will still be at the same uncertainty as it was in the state of nature. So Locke believes that this unified creation called government should be a government of laws, and it should be under the will of the people. Locke further said, wherever law ends, tyranny begins, and surely he had Cromwell in mind when he made that statement. Both Hobbes and Locke went to the beginnings of mankind to discover a need for government. But Hobbes described a social contract in which the people in the state of nature gave up their individual rights to a strong sovereign. Locke, on the other hand, saw that people contracted with each other for a particular kind of government, and they retained the rights to modify or change that government if it proved to be offensive to them. Locke also believed that that government must be a government of laws, that once established, all members of the government, including the sovereign, should obey the laws. In the United States, we've seen several instances where presidents have been severely reprimanded, perhaps even threatened to be removed from office and forced to resign, because they have believed in some way or other that they are above the law, either moral or the conventional legal system. So you could ask yourself this question: could you have a very strong government, that is a dictatorship, and still have the rule of law? And I believe the answer to that is probably no, because in a dictatorship there is often, and perhaps required, the deviation of the rule of law for those in power. And that cannot be if it is truly a rule of law. Locke and Hobbes were led to different conclusions. It is highly likely that Hobbes's conclusions came about because of his trust in absolute monarchs, whereas Locke had a fear and distaste for absolute monarchs, and he therefore came to the conclusion that people entered into their contract and they only selected monarchs to guide them. Locke's concepts were very powerful in his day, and they influenced Parliament, and the people that they chose, they obviously brought in William and Mary to replace James II, and from that time on, Parliament began to gain power as they saw themselves following the rule of law, and they saw themselves as instruments of the people, and therefore higher than the king. It also gave people in general in England the right to criticize their leaders, and as we've already seen in our lecture on limited monarchs, in England that governmental criticism was reasonably well accepted. Very few were persecuted for their criticism. Some additional criticism might be shown with other people in England who lived at about that time. One of those was Edward Gibbon, who wrote Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. His criticism was not just about the nature of government, but even more about the nature of religion. He believed that it was the Christian bias of the Roman Empire that eventually led to its demise. He said, how can you turn the other cheek when you're a military empire that relies on power to, or relies on military power to stay in control? You might ask yourself, do you think, as did Gibbon, that the adoption of Christianity by the Roman Empire weakened that empire? Or do you believe that Christianity extended the empire and gave it really a foundation on which it could build for its later time? Another interesting writer and critic of this period was Alexander Pope. He was less a critic of the government and more a critic of the English people. A poet who wrote a book called Essay on Man and another called An Essay on Criticism, and they're pithy statements, some of which I'm sure you have heard. He cautioned the Enlightenment thinkers to not be too anxious to become too learned. He thought that there was still a place for God in everybody's life, and he did not agree with the idea that as you gain more and more knowledge, you can rise above the need for God. In fact, he said, a little learning is a dangerous thing. Listen to his comment on nature and God's building of nature as its creator. He said, all nature is but art, unknown to thee, all chance, direction, which thou canst not see, all discord, harmony, not understood, all partial evil, universal good, and spite of pride and erring reason's spite, one truth is clear, whatever is right. Pope is saying here that God created the world in an ideal way from God's viewpoint. And if we criticize trouble or difficulties and strange occurrences in our own mind, it's only because they're in our own mind and we do not understand the ways of God. He compared that to a young man and his father. This is a marvelous statement that every generation should read to the next. We think our fathers fools, so wise we grow. Our wiser sons, no doubt, will think us so. We've already talked about how Pope revered Newton. He said, nature and nature's laws lay hid at night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light. Well, that's the English Enlightenment, and as those English Enlightenment thinkers solidified their thinking and continued in England, we see that there was a transfer of this same inquiry and application of science to humankind over in France. In France, these Enlightenment thinkers were called philosophes. And although that word is a general word for philosopher, it has been applied in particular to those thinkers during the Enlightenment period in France who gave a foundation for the French and American revolutions. The philosophes were optimistic about the future. They really did believe in the inevitability of progress. They believed that improvements could be measured in three respects. The first, gaining rational knowledge of the natural world and technology, in essence, the furthering of science. Two, overcoming ignorance that came from religions and superstitions. And three, overcoming human cruelty and violence through social improvements in government structures. They saw a scientifically based, moral utopian society as the logical outgrowth of the Enlightenment. Now, speaking about these Enlightenment people individually, let's begin with the greatest of the French philosophes. His name was Voltaire. Not his real name, it was a pen name, but everybody calls him Voltaire, so we will too. He was a deist and highly critical of the Catholic Church. He grew up in strongly Catholic France and saw many of the corrupt practices and evil ways of the Catholic Church, especially in the way that the clergy separated themselves from the common people and how the church itself was oppressive on the common people. Voltaire was a famous writer. He wrote hundreds of letters and plays and stories and articles. And in one of those, he was very critical of a French nobleman. So critical, in fact, that the nobleman became very, very angry, and he sent some thugs to beat Voltaire up, which they did. And then the nobleman took Voltaire to court and accused him of defaming the nobleman. It was obvious that Voltaire had done that, and even though it was true, still the nobles were protected in France in those days, and therefore it was the court found against Voltaire, and Voltaire was sent out of the country, exiled, and he went to England. While living in England, he became acquainted with the writings of Newton and, in fact, became a friend of Newton's niece. And this is when the niece told Voltaire the story of the apple falling on Newton's head. When Voltaire returned to France, he wrote a translation of Newton's work, and he popularized Newton's work and sold it to the French people as a way of introducing the concepts of this new thing called science. When Voltaire returned, he did not go to Paris. He went to a chateau that he had purchased. It was on the French-Swiss border, thinking that if the French authorities came to get him, he would cross into Switzerland, but if the Swiss authorities came to get him, he would cross into France. So he felt safe and lived there for all but the last few months of his life. And a small deviation toward the latter part of his life when he went to live in Prussia, as we'll talk about in a later time. He was certainly the leader of the French Enlightenment, and as I mentioned, he went and lived for a short period of time with Frederick II in Prussia. More about that later. When he came back to France and became an old man, he was well respected by the people and extremely popular because of his plays and stories. And therefore, it was the desire of the government to rehabilitate him, and they agreed that they would allow him to return to Paris and not persecute him in any way. And therefore, Voltaire came back to Paris and lived the remainder of his life there. And when he died, he was buried in the Pantheon, which is the church in Paris where famous French thinkers and military leaders and political leaders are buried. I suppose the most famous of all of Voltaire's statements is the following: "I do not agree with a word you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." And Voltaire really did mean that. He would criticize people for what they said, but he never suggested that they be denied the right to say it. Well, we've talked about Voltaire and the person and a little bit about his life. Let's talk about what he believed and what he advocated. As I mentioned, he was against organized religion. This is what he said: "All nature cries aloud that he, God, does exist, that there is a supreme intelligence, an immense power, an admirable order, and everything teaches us our own dependence on it." This is a deist statement, very powerful one. In fact, it's a statement of belief in God in any regard. He further said, "Morality is everywhere the same for all men. Therefore it comes from God. Sects differ. Therefore they are the work of men." Here he is, anti-organized religion, but still a strong proponent of the existence of God. Voltaire believed that churches become exclusive, and in fact, he called it sectarian exclusivism, and he condemned it as being too narrow. He said Catholicism is one of the reasons, or the belief in a true Catholic Church is one of the reasons that there's been difficulties in history and lots of corruption. Everybody pointing their fingers at the others and saying it's their fault. And of course, this same feeling has led to religious wars, especially those that occurred about a century before Voltaire. Voltaire then said on that concept, the issue of tolerance among religious sects, this little globe, which is but a point, rolls through space, as do many other globes. We are lost in the immensity of the universe. Man, only 5 feet high, is assuredly only a small thing in creation. One of these imperceptible beings says to another, one of his neighbors, in Arabia or South Africa, "Listen to me, because God of all these worlds has enlightened me. There are 900 million little ants like us on the earth, but my ant hole is the only one dear to God. All the others are cast off by Him for eternity. Mine alone will be happy, and all the others will be eternally damned." It's interesting that this sectarian rivalry has been so strong, especially within Christianity, but we see it in other religions as well, for instance, Shiites and Sunnis in Islam, and there are other conflicts among churches throughout the world. I think we should stand back and think about this with respect to Mormonism. In my view, Mormonism may be the religion that is the answer to the problems of these Enlightenment thinkers. You might ask, well, how can that be? What are the features of LDS belief that allow this statement to be true? One is individualism in Mormonism. In the LDS faith, we believe that each individual has the right to receive revelation, to confirm those things that are told to us by our leaders. We do not deny that God speaks through a prophet, but we do propound that each individual has a right to confirmation of the prophet's teachings through individual acceptance of the inspiration of the Holy Ghost. Second, Mormons believe in science. They accept that science is a legitimate method of finding the truth. In fact, Mormon doctrine is just simply this: it is truth wherever it is found. And that truth could be found by science, or it could be found by religion or philosophy or by any other means. And if it's true, as seen from God's perspective, then Mormons would accept it. In addition, Mormons have no creed. They do accept all truth. And therefore, because they have no creed, they have no limits on their beliefs. They believe everything that is true. In fact, Joseph Smith taught, while one portion of the human race is judging and condemning the other without mercy, the great parent of the universe looks upon the whole of the human family with a fatherly care and paternal regard. He will judge them not according to what they have not, but according to what they have. Those who have lived without law will be judged without law, and those who have a law will be judged by that law. In other words, we should look at the LDS faith not as a faith that is the only truth. It is merely a faith that has more of the truth. And therefore, other churches are to be respected for the truths that they have, and the people, when converted, should be shown that they are gaining additional truths. There are some corrections of errors, to be sure, but the LDS faith is a faith that relies on the gaining of knowledge and truth. Well, Voltaire continued to evolve in his thinking regarding God, and the problem is centered around the difficulty for Voltaire of the question of evil. He asked this question: is God all-powerful and all good? If so, why is there evil and suffering? And in particular, he was concerned about a great earthquake that occurred in Lisbon, Portugal during his life. This earthquake caused tremendous suffering. And Voltaire said, if God exists, how could he allow such suffering to occur? And that must have been the spark that caused Voltaire to write his book, Candide. Let me just tell you a little bit about this book. It's a story of a young man named Candide and his mentor, whose name is Pangloss. Pangloss means say everything, speak all of the words, lots of words. They go through a series of misadventures in their lives, separated, traveling the world, finding all kinds of problems. But at one point, they're together in the harbor of Lisbon and they see this terrible destruction that has occurred because of the earthquake. And Candide asks Pangloss why this is so. And Pangloss just simply says, it's God's will. That's unsatisfactory for Candide. He therefore moves away from his belief in God. And we can see that Candide's opinion reflects Voltaire's. Candide finally ended up with no belief in God. And that's probably where Voltaire finally ended up. He saw these as alternatives to this coexistence of God and his power with suffering. He said, first alternative is that God ignores suffering. The second is that God can't stop the suffering, in which case he would be impotent. Or maybe God causes the suffering, in which case he's demonic. And a fourth is that God doesn't exist. And that's finally where Voltaire came down, that there is no God. What kind of answers could you give to Voltaire regarding the problem of evil and suffering? You might think about it, it's a problem not easily solved. An interesting note regarding suffering is this. The definition of suffering is actually to allow. Therefore, suffering, to allow bad things to happen, is not necessarily bad. We think of suffering in terms of the animal sense, where we always flee pain, but perhaps we should think of it also in terms of gaining experience and living a more complete life. C.S. Lewis, a great Christian thinker, has said the following. When troubles come along, illnesses, money, troubles, new kinds of temptation, he, man, is disappointed. These things he feels might have been necessary to rouse him and make him repent in his bad old days, but why now? Because God is forcing him on or up to a higher level, putting him into situations where he will have to be very much braver, or more patient, or more loving than he ever dreamed of being before. It seems to us all unnecessary, but that is because we have not yet had the slightest notion of the tremendous thing he means to make of us. Very interesting possibility that in God's view, all of these things are necessary so that we can move forward. Well, Voltaire was not happy with that argument, and it was given to him. He said, "The silly fanatic repeats to me that it is not for us to judge what is reasonable and just in the great being, that his reason is not like our reason, that his justice is not like our justice." How, you mad demoniac? Do you want me to judge justice and reason otherwise than by the notions I have of them? In other words, he says, the only power I have to judge justice is my own mind, and therefore I must use that. What Voltaire really wanted was to have all of the purposes of God transparent to him, to have life itself completely transparent to him. He wanted all the answers. You know, that's an interesting problem. Let's take an example of a window. We look through the window and it appears to be transparent, doesn't it? We can see the trees and the bushes and the grass behind. But that's only possible because some things are opaque. When we look through the window, the tree is opaque, the grass is opaque, the wall is opaque, and the bushes are opaque. As it turns out, the only thing transparent is the window itself. If we had everything transparent, we'd look through a window and not be able to distinguish anything because we'd see through them all. Therefore, in this life, we really only get perspective and understanding because some things are not transparent. We might ask ourselves, do we need to have an answer for everything that happens? Joseph Smith has given us a good reply. The destinies of all people are in the hands of a just God, and he will do no injustice to anyone. And this one thing is sure, that they who will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. And before their robes are made white in the blood of the Lamb, it is to be expected, according to John the Revelator, they will pass through great tribulation. So what should be our actions in the face of doubt? What are the consequences of doubt? Well, it could be cynicism, could be apathy, could be anger, could be self-doubt, could be confusion and disbelief. But we might ask, is there some action that we should take even though we may or may not have all the answers? That answer, of course, is faith. Well, at the end of Candide, Voltaire gave this suggestion: let us all tend our garden. What does that mean to you, tending your garden? Well, it probably means that you should do your very best to improve the world, regardless of your belief. There's a lot of truth in that, but if you can help others gain a stronger belief and a peaceful inner heart, that's probably worthwhile too. Now let's talk about a second great philosophe. His name is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He lived about a half a generation after Voltaire. As a young man, Jean-Jacques Rousseau entered a contest, and the contest had as a theme that all people should address: does progress in the arts and sciences correspond with progress in morality? Remember now, this is just after the scientific revolution. It is the application of science to the world other than the natural world. And therefore, most people, when they answered this question, said, yes, scientific progress improves morality. Jean-Jacques Rousseau took the opposite view. He said no, and he cited instances throughout history where science and the arts made morality worse. What reasons can you give that would support Rousseau's answer? We might say, well, there were times when science caused war, or when technology made war worse, and so on. Jean-Jacques Rousseau also wanted to apply his thinking to government. And like Hobbes and Locke, he went back to the origins of civilization. He wrote a book called The Social Contract, and it begins with a very famous line: man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. Remember now, Rousseau is writing before the French Revolution. He introduced a concept of noble savage, that is, a person of instinctive goodness, and he believed that early society was composed of mostly noble savages, people who interacted on a moral and noble basis. He therefore believed that these people, in moral good sense, joined together in a social contract. So he believes much like Locke, except that where Locke said that early mankind was good but was often fearful, I suppose that Rousseau would have believed the same thing, and then they both agreed that mankind joined together in a social contract of forming the government. Do you believe that original mankind was noble savages, or do you believe that mankind maybe had some problems with each other and with the world around them? Many people today believe in the noble savage concept, and they look at American Indians and say, well, the American Indians were noble savages. They were people who were uninformed, hence the word savage, but they were noble and they lived in harmony with nature. That may be true, but there is strong evidence that many of the tribes of American Indians were inherently warlike and discriminatory and really brutal to their neighbors. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's teachings that the social contract was formed by the will of the people and that the will of the people should be supreme, that concept served as the basis for the French Revolution. In fact, the very motto of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, those words were taken from Rousseau's teachings. He believed in dominance of the legislature, that is, those elected by the people, and he believed in strict rule of the majority. He believed that the government was like a corporation with the citizens as shareholders, and when the government improved, like the corporation went up, then everybody benefited. When the government went down, the shareholders had the obligation to change the leadership of the government, leadership of the corporation, so that they could improve. Hence, we can compare Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. Hobbes said that mankind is inherently savage and needs a king. Locke said that mankind wants peace and freedom and forms a social contract to government to protect themselves. Rousseau said that mankind is a noble savage that is inherently good and has government to improve the benefits of his life. You might ask yourself which view is most like the United States government. Well, clearly we based our government on the words of Locke, and we have some protections against absolute majority, so we do not follow completely the concepts of Rousseau. Standing back now and taking a long view, if we look at history as a human, we see that the ancient world was divided into Christianity and paganism, like two legs. Then we see the Middle Ages, where Christianity became important and it was unitary. Then we look further and we see the period of the Reformation, where Protestants and Catholics were divided. And now, at least according to the Enlightenment, they see the period of the Enlightenment where there is a unitary growth and it's centered on the mind. Thank you very much.